I'll try to make it easier by two things. I'll try to talk quite fast so that I'm done in half an hour or even less so, and I'll try to excite you around the questions of citizenship, activism, and actually new forms of citizenship and new forms of subjectivities. And as many people had many things to say about floods, I'm sure that many of you have many things to say about actually emergence of new social movements, Occupy movement, and do we really deal here with something new, or actually it is just an exception to the dominant rule and to the dominant forms of citizenship. You'll see that, and many of you who know me, that you know that I am in a way active in these movements, or I at least support them quite publicly, and especially the movements that work with direct democracy, horizontality, and participation. So in that manner, I'll use this opportunity to have all these people here in the audience to turn my presentation not as to turn it into a crowdsourcing event. Yeah? So basically, I'm trying not to impress you with my brilliant thoughts. I'm trying to use you to help me to maybe one day think, at least in a good way, if not in a brilliant way. So I'm sure that you'll lend me your hand here at this occasion, and I'll I'm trying to figure out if this okay, I'm just trying to figure out my notes. Adriana was talking already about questions related to citizenship, and she mentioned a very important thing. It is a very difficult term, and I've been working on citizenship for quite some time, and it does change, its meaning does change. In America, it's not one thing. In the United Kingdom, another. In France, it's something else. And here in the former Yugoslavia, due to certain terminology, it's been not much used and not much used on the left. And of course, there's many things to explain. Maybe we could take Balibar, who is trying to explain the difference between citizen, citoyen, bourgeois, and so the problem of rise of citizenship at the time of the rise of bourgeois societies, and then the relationship of this term towards vis-a-vis class struggles. However, I will try to rehabilitate the term. I think it's a useful term, and I think it's also a useful term for leftist strategy. I will start with a very simple distinction that I think we have to bear in mind. And this is what we very often hear, and we heard it on the TV these days, things about active citizenship. Yeah, be active. I will introduce at the beginning immediately the distinction suggested by Engin Aysin, or Engin Isin, or as our friend Efe will know, real name is Engin Ishin, the theorist of citizenship, who distinguishes between active and activist citizenship. So what does he mean by that? He basically means that in all societies there's a space for active citizenship. This is a space that is regulated, offered to you by state, by the government, and so on. And even being an active citizen is something you should do. Being an activist means going beyond these spaces, opening up new spaces of citizenship, or conquering these spaces, even if this means challenging a legal order. And all big victories on this field been done in this rather problematic moment when you challenge a legal order in the name of legitimacy. That's the sort of insurgency or revolutionary situation you have to face if you want to bring something new. However, it's not devoid of contradictions and enormous problems. I would like just to remind you, because we mentioned socialism a couple of times, that there were different conceptions of citizenship in socialism and in liberal democracy. I totally reject the liberal democratic idea that in socialism there was no citizenship. So that's the idea that comes from liberal theory, that citizenship is only possible in democracy. It is related to the same idea that federalism was not possible in socialism, because federalism could only function in democracy, whereas in socialism it was federalism only on paper. Well, Yugoslavia is a colossal example how this is not true and how federalism actually functioned quite well. The same I want to say for citizenship in socialist states vis-a-vis liberal democratic ones. So in a socialist state, what that meant to be active? Adriana mentioned active citizens meant also sometimes voting. In former Yugoslavia, there was a delegate system, but there were also elections. That meant going to elections. It meant to be very solidary, to also give your money. Solidarity that was at the level of socialist community, but also at the international level. In '61, there were huge demonstrations when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in Belgium, in Congo, of course, by the Belgians. There was a huge type of international solidarity that was meant to be part of you as an active citizen, because you are not only citizen of Yugoslavia, you are citizen of the world, and we should help our brothers who are fighting for the same things from wherever they come. This culminated in a non-aligned movement, as you know. It also meant being active in your trade unions. So you fight for your rights and so on. So this is what an active citizen does. The problem with activist citizenship in socialism was that it came mostly as a critique of socialism as both ideology and system, usually by intellectuals. That activism was a difficult one in terms of occupying spaces, but we also saw something like that. For instance, in this city in '68, when students occupied university, that was something that you could see as an activist citizenship. They occupied university and basically said, we want socialism. We don't want this sort of state capitalist socialism that you are selling us. We want real socialism. And that was quite a difficult moment for the regime. The problems, of course, were, and this is, and I come to this when I speak about activism, okay, once we occupy, what we really want. You know the dissidents in countries under the Soviet domination, that this was very often writers, intellectuals, very often in forms of samizdat or self-published manifestos, that it was difficult, quite difficult, as we saw with Solidarity, to occupy and to suggest something new. And Solidarity started as a leftist movement, which is being forgotten now, and as a very direct democratic movement against the Stalinism of the state. However, we ended up with the idea that as for the new, for something that will come after socialism, we don't need to invent anything new. We need just to import from the West. And that meant liberal democracy and capitalism. Now, clearly you see what means to be active citizen in liberal democracies. Go to vote when we call you upon, which is every 4 years. Maybe you can be a member of an NGO. Many of us are, so you can be part of civil society. Civil society is this nice balance and so on. It's, of course, infested with government NGOs, but doesn't matter. Three people can have an NGO. So now, for instance, you have a proliferation of NGO, but not so much of democracy. It would sometimes involve occasional deliberations, usually top down. Come here, let's talk about it. Let's hear what citizens say. It might offer, like in the EU, this wonderful democratic participatory mechanism that if you have to collect a number of signatures, like more than 1 million, and then Commission will take into account what you are actually asking for. So go around Europe, collect 1 million, you have to have certain number of signatures for 7 states, then Commission, it's not that it's obligatory, but will take it into account. And this was, of course, championed in the Year of Citizen, which was the last year in the European Union. You can demonstrate. It's not totalitarian system. Yes, of course, but usually those are kettle demonstrations, as we lovely call them in the UK. You are kettle, so come into kettle demonstrations, which mean you've been, clearly surveyed and monitored, and your space for doing something is almost nothing. Beautiful example. 60 million people all across cities of Europe against the war in Iraq. What happened? Nothing. In London that day, there was more than 1 million people. Something happened? Absolutely nothing. War happened, exactly. Exactly. So you can definitely say whatever you want, but the influence on elites is rather narrow. Elections, as we know, are extremely narrow. So now we are coming to the situation in which we have to think about activism and activist citizenship. What is this in these liberal democracies? And as I mentioned, I was quite inspired by the Zhang and Isin's distinction. There are other authors who are also trying to make this distinction between these sort of activists, sort of opening up new spaces, inventing spaces, as they would say, of citizenship, where you can forge new political subjectivities. However, since I decided, and now at the Edinburgh College of Art, I'm working on occupation of spaces and the relationship between the aesthetics and the political, and how the art plays a role. How creative practices within occupied spaces plays a role. But I was also interested in political creativity, and this is where you might help me. How we occupy something, and then what do we do? How do we organize? Do we really invent something new, or we go back to the practices of the 60s or 70s, or we go back to some other practice? I don't know, Paris Commune of Paris or whatever. And how do we do it? Do we do it hierarchically, horizontally? In what kind of way we organize life in the occupied spaces that we contrast to the spaces governed by law? So this is, this will be overstretching it, but going back to this sort of, it is upon us to create a real state of emergency, real state of exception, and this will help our position against fascism, yeah? As Benjamin put it, and it's been over-quoted and quoted all the time. Just to see whether these are the real states of exception, and do they really bring something new? Of course, the question of art I'll take out of this. I think it does speak, that aesthetical imagination and creative imagination does speak to what is happening politically, but this is what I'll be doing over the next 3 years in Edinburgh. In order to understand what is happening with activism, not only occupations, but activism, so going outside of the prescribed spaces, I start to think about activist citizenship as 3 things. Activist citizenship as protest, activist citizenship as critique, and finally, and the most complicated one, activist citizenship as emancipation. Now, what would be activist citizenship as a protest? So, as I mentioned, the one protest that indeed step outside of the invited spaces of active citizenship. In a way, this is how Occupy movement started. You go outside of the spaces that have been there for you, you go to Zuccotti Park, you occupy it, and you start the protest movement. But very often, and also we saw it in many countries in the Balkans, especially lately, just start with Slovenia or Bosnia and so on, where a huge number of demonstrations and protests happen. It is a reaction. It is a protest, a rally, an act against either government or a certain policies, very often single issue one, that could generate a wider mobilization. It could involve days of actions, large demonstration, street and square resistances. Greece offers a huge, Europe today offers enormous amount of examples for this. However, I'm interested in what I'm thinking about activism as critique. It's more about, is the protest that is happening also has an element of critique of political and socioeconomic system we live in. So this would be a critique. This means that we do protest, for instance, in Slovenia, and we do reject representative corrupt elites. We do reject liberal democracy as such a representation, and also we criticize the capitalist system. And this is happening in the Balkans. There is a wave of similar protests that are now putting in question both representative system and capitalist socioeconomic relations. However, of course, we could now ask something that might interest us as intellectuals, is there a critique without protest? So can we think about activism as a critique without protest? Now, this would mean to see, for instance, I would say that we, especially in liberal societies, very often have a chance to be active citizens who do produce a critique of the system, but without joining the action. So this is the urgency of thought and the urgency of action. Great examples of this are our dear beloved friends Zizek and Badiou. Yeah? So you can really do it. You can be extremely radical in what you are saying. People do read you. You inspire people. But politically you are not operational. Yeah? You do not. And even maybe we don't want Zizek and Badiou to actually join any of these movements. But you are extremely loud. Yeah? So when this becomes activist, in liberal democracies, when our writing becomes activist in liberal democracies, it's a difficult point to make. Maybe when it's repressed or forbidden or whatever, and maybe some people, such as Assange or Snowden, show us a better example of indeed activist citizenship at the global level. However, we saw the examples of crossing the line between academia and being active criticizer of the system and some sort of activist citizenship. We could maybe see the David Graeber, Simon Critchley, these people who flirted with Occupy, who went there and actually, or initiated this, might be these figures who decided to say, okay, it's fine to be in academia and say whatever I want, but I want to do something else. Okay, I'm just, or Antonio Negri in the 70s. A complex case, but an interesting one. Now, and I'm coming to the emancipation and this idea of activist citizenship as emancipation. And here is how I see it. So clearly it is something that challenges legal space for active citizenship. It is often coupled with protest. It does express general critique. It has to express general critique of the regime you live in. Otherwise, why to emancipate yourself? But it is also at the same time challenges current political model by offering a new political model and even a space for different social relations. And, as we would say, new subjectivities. Now, the problem, of course, is I would say, I'll give you a couple of examples that I think have emancipatory potential. I'm not sure if this is emancipation and what is it. This is where we'll open this question. But for instance, Occupy movement could be seen as such, but it's open to discussion. Recent resurgence of citizens' assemblies in Bosnia. I'm sure many of you followed that. After protests, there was a resurgence of plenums. So the word plenum came back. And in many cities in Bosnia, you got citizens' assemblies with various degrees of success, but there's absolutely, for me, the most extraordinary political event that happened in former Yugoslavia over the last 20 years. It was completely spontaneous, yeah? So there is an organization of citizens into some sort of citizens' assemblies where people actually debated the most important thing. And of course, the most important thing in Bosnia is not these stupid entities, districts and whatever, how they call them, but it's like, can we actually survive? Are socioeconomic issues. So it was very interesting how this came after all this violence that had been done on these people, that the question of social justice came out. And I often like to contrast two countries, Slovenia on one hand and Bosnia. So in Slovenia you have, and here it was amply shown that many of our teachers were here. They have excellent intellectual culture, absolutely progressive, left-wing, amazing, and I mean, you know, always 3 steps ahead. And you got insurgency, but it went down very well. You didn't get plenums. That was a step too far. Then in Bosnia, the country with no progressive left-wing strong culture or a scene, because it's been either exiled or destroyed, suddenly comes out completely spontaneously with elements of a very radical forms of organizing, which is citizens' assemblies. It was, you know, anarchist dream came true. It is in the people. Anarchism is in the people. They don't need to read Bakunin or have degrees. It is in them. They could spontaneously organize. Of course, there are many complexities of that, but as a case, I think it's extremely interesting one. Now, we witnessed also occupations of theaters. As many of you know, Teatro Vale and Ambrose Theater in Greece, and where people basically in the name of common good, in the name of the commons, occupy the public space, organize autonomously, and then started producing a certain political and artistic creative results. Interestingly enough, in this region again, but also in Chile and so on, occupation of universities is very similar kind of thing. You occupy public space that is supposed to provide with the public good, and you impose in this space a different model of self-rule and of self-organization, usually almost always direct democracy, yeah? Or horizontal democracy. Now, of course, and I think I have 5 more minutes, yeah? 5, yeah, 5. And I run through many things I have here. Of course, emancipation, I'm puzzled with the word. Yeah? We use it a lot, especially in the leftist discourse, and I'm trying to understand it better. And interestingly, of course, etymologically, it's like basically freeing someone from slavery. Yeah? It comes from that. Someone that cannot be sold anymore, which is very interesting. It resonates with our times. I won't be able to be sold anymore. I'll be emancipated. In this era, it's the era of indebtedness. Yeah? So I have to be first emancipated from my debt, and then emancipated as a citizen consumer in neoliberal societies to maybe reach some kind of emancipation. Well, good luck with this. The problem is that the debts are enormous, and either you can kill your banker or abolish the system that basically imposed all this on you, or go somewhere else and establish something totally new. Now, very difficult thing to do. This always, wherever emancipation comes, it's always emancipation from. What I would like to think these spaces and these new subjectivities has been emancipation for. And I invite you to let us think together about what would be emancipation for. And of course, first has to be emancipation from something and then for something. And this is where today we have a problem. I think there is an urgency to figure out what to do. But we have a problem in defining what to do. One thing that seems to me crucial is the space. And this is what Tomáš also mentioned. Yeah, repression is global, problems are global. There are problems we cannot solve locally. We have to solve them globally, and the repression is global, but the rebellion or resistance to it is local. It has to be local, and then it's always embedded within a local context with local histories and local rivalries and whatever. The problem, of course, is what to occupy in order to give a space, to give a literal space for a new political subjectivities to flourish. Theater, university, gather at plenums that were not occupations, but people gathered, but it wasn't occupied. States, go somewhere else and establish something. Of course, the greatest example of all, I'm not sure that everyone will be willing to follow, but I think we should think about it. The greatest recent examples is the Zapatistas rebellion in Mexico. People like us who decided to go into the jungle, into among the oppressed minority, and states let them be there with occasional repression by sending paramilitaries, special forces to kill people around, but basically let them have their buen vivir, let them have their good governance there. But they survived, and they're still around. And I think it's an interesting example for us to think about. Is it possible to replicate it? I'm not entirely sure. Just to conclude, I'll refer, because I mentioned his name before, and there are a number of names, but I didn't want to give you too many quotes, and there's too many. Rather, I wanted to open questions. Alain Badiou, in his recent seminar in March, where basically he comes, and I was also in his seminar at one point because I was studying at Paris State, and it's very interesting, and he's a very good performer. And he speaks about many, many things. In this occasion, he was speaking about Ukraine and so on. And of course, he didn't give a very sophisticated analysis of Ukrainian situation like we heard from Tomasz, but basically went back to the Second World War to say that Ukrainians used to be fascists, so basically why should we support them? That quite resonates well here. This kind of thinking about that there's something essential in certain people. Although we see resurgence of Ukrainian fascism, but I would hardly accept the idea that all Ukrainians are fascist. And there he is basically trying to say, look, everything that happened from Tahrir to Maidan, from Occupy, from Puerta del Sol and so on, it's not the real thing. It is, as he calls it, negative declaration. So basically he is saying, by using negative declaration, he's saying this is a resistance. This is a resistance to something. And we are now in the situation like in the 19th century where negation became clear to us. So it's clear that we are now against this form of capitalism, call it neoliberal what. It wasn't that clear. Certainly it wasn't clear in the Balkans. It seems it's not still clear in some places that we want to resist this, but we don't want what else to suggest. There is a negative declaration, there is no affirmative declaration. And therefore, Badiou doesn't see these things. Anyway, there is nothing, of course, after Cultural Revolution, for him, there is nothing worth of mentioning, and all these movements and whatever is happening simply do not bring anything new. And of course, this is debatable. Do they bring anything new, especially these big squares and big protest movements? I would, however, argue that there is a positive declaration, or elements of positive declaration in Occupy, in occupations of universities and theaters, that we do deal here, maybe, with something that we could call it's called prefigurative politics, laboratories where maybe new subjectivities are formed, and that spaces of emancipation as a process rather than as emancipation as an end result just because we go and occupy. And now in 2 minutes, I'll go through the problems that might arise from here, of course, in a preemptive strike. You already thought about this, but in order to preempt your reaction, I'll self-criticize myself, and then, leave you a bit of space, and hopefully you'll come with a lot of inspiring thoughts, especially for my research. Now, the question is, of course, I was constantly talking about positive activist citizen. This is all very positive, yeah? We protest, we critique, we emancipate ourselves and the others. What about negative? So I would use the very negative example of activist citizenship, which is the self-immolations. As you know, Mohamed Bouazizi from Tunisia self-immolated himself. That sparked the revolution. This is why we know about him. Only last year in Bulgaria, we had 7 self-immolations. Started with a man whose name is already, for us Slavic speakers, quite difficult, or in a way brings an image of fire. Plamen Goranov. The poor guy was called Plamen Goranov. He self-immolated himself in the town of, I don't know, Varna or whatever. Then there was the 7 people. The revolution? No, that didn't happen. So you got this in Romania. The man killed himself in the Romanian parliament because they cut him the last kind of 50 euros of social help with which he was buying medicine for his ill son. So tragedies are all around this. I see it as a negative activist. Why it's activist? It's definitely going outside of what is prescribed. Yeah, you are not supposed to kill yourself, and certainly not in a public space, and certainly not by delivering this kind of message. Yeah, but of course, it's negative because it's the end of it. It's absolute despair. Yeah, this is not opening any space. It's open space of death, and might help our critique and our protest, and maybe initiate us to think about emancipation, but it's certainly awful for people who kill themselves. Of course, the problem is Can violent acts be seen as activist citizenship? And this is the old problem for leftist strategy. What about violence? There is a violence of the system. Is it legitimate to respond with violence? What kind of violence? And again, Maidan is Euromaidan, as they called it, is a great example of right-wing activism. Is that the way to go? So can this be seen as activist citizenship? You know, you build barricades in a good old revolutionary fashion, you self-organize. There was even, they say, a bit of direct democracy, but not much. You know, it was, but in a way, we have to address this type of right-wing, populist mobilization. Is this activist citizenship? It's open to debate. Anyhow, I think that the question, the importance for emancipation is the question of exclusion or inclusion. There cannot be emancipation that is exclusionary. At least this is my argument. And if you occupy space, it has to be inclusive. This brings us to a number of questions, but I cannot see right-wing or fascist violence or organization as being emancipating, although it is for them always emancipating, but for a certain, quite precisely defined group. Now, the question with which I'll finish this, and in less two seconds, it's of course the question that is around us, and we are constantly thinking about. Can the subjects form in the system of oppression, in this context, system of liberal, democratic, and capitalist oppression, actually be subjects of emancipation and revolution? Can subjects formed psychologically as subjects rather than, and also only limitingly citizens, can be actually activists or revolutionaries or emancipators? And again, which spaces, as I mentioned, for this emancipation, and how this will play out with the strategy of new social movements and new subjectivities that are desperate to express themselves. But what kind of form this expression will have, it's definitely an urgent task for us all, for both thought and action. Thank you very much.